For reasons you've just heard, I am enormously grateful to the organisers here. I mean, what they have done for me is fantastic. They have agreed to translate 2 books into Slovenian, which for me is wonderful, and also organised this amazingly interesting workshop and just invited us to this beautiful city. There are so many things to be grateful for. And the sessions today are concerned with issues that I've been involved in a long time, material culture and consumption. So in a way, it may sound a bit strange because I don't appear to be addressing the sessions. I'm giving a paper about social media. And it sounds like, oh, you know, there he was working on all this material culture and consumption, etc. And now, you know, all that's kind of gone in the past and there's onto some sort of new stuff and he's going to talk about all that kind of new stuff. And if I did that, it would actually sound a little bit rude, really, that, you know, I'm so grateful for what you've done and yet what am I doing? Something else. But of course, the point I want to make is that that is absolutely not true. That I believed from the beginning that the right people to be working on digital media and social media were those who were involved in precisely material culture and the study of consumption. Because I felt that that approach would do something that was very, very different from the mainstream attempts to understand these new phenomena. And the lecture I'm giving today is basically an attempt to demonstrate just that. This is not the repudiation of the work on material culture and consumption. It is showing precisely how important it is in applying it to new domains. Because from our point of view, it is simply not the case that this is a shift towards the immaterial or a shift towards a set of technologies as opposed to consumption. Actually, what we have been dealing with in this project is A, the materiality, whether it's the smartphones versus the computer, but more than that, it's because we see this material as content. That we look at it in terms of the history of photography, the aesthetics of memes, the actual forms and genres that it's composed of. And secondly, we see it as acts of consumption. That is to say, other people may focus on the platforms and the differences between Twitter and Facebook, but my argument will be, actually, it continues to be radically transformed by consumption in each and every place in which this kind of activity takes place. So it is only through its study as material culture and consumption that you are really going to understand these huge contemporary phenomena such as social media. But it's one thing to say that, we have to give evidence. We're academics, right? So what do? What we did was to create a team of 9 anthropologists who made the commitment that they would, with an open mind, simply do very traditional anthropology. That is to say, they would sit in communities all around the world for 16 months and try and look at the use and consequence of social media to find out what it actually is, as opposed to all the things that people were claiming about in newspapers, etc., that, you know, oh, young people don't understand what a friend is today because they're confused by social media, or cognitive abilities are kind of being transformed because Twitter is so short, and all those kind of stuff you hear about, right? We have to try and do a different kind of study. And we worked in very diverse places. Very briefly, in a low-income copper mining area in Chile, in a very low-income place in Brazil where people are working as builders and waiters and so forth. In Trinidad, I worked in villages just north of London. We have a site in the very south, Puglia of Italy. We have a site right on the border between Syria and Turkey, a town called Mardin. We have a site which is an IT complex set in the middle of villages in South India, so you have both the villagers and you have the IT professionals. And China is the place where we had these two sites. One is a fairly traditional sort of rural town, and the other is somebody who actually lived, Xinyan 1, lived inside one of the new factories. Factories that represent 250 million people who have moved from rural areas into the factory system. Now, when you've got 9 sites like that, it's not hard to do surveys. But actually, for all sorts of reasons, we didn't really trust this kind of material because we find, for example, people interpret the questions that you ask very different from place to place. So that it looks very kind of objective. Actually, in many ways, this kind of material can be quite misleading. But it does do one thing. It establishes right from the beginning our, in a sense, primary point, which is simply that social media is not the same all the way around the world. That there is clearly core differences depending on where exactly you are, and you have to account for these differences. In a way, a more effective means for showing that was simply the differences that emerged from our qualitative material. So when one of the people in China and one of them in Brazil shows a photo that looks pretty similar to each other, somebody with their iPhone posing basically, actually we know that in one case it's because they've now got all the money that they could afford an iPhone and they're showing off what they're doing, and in the other case they've just borrowed every single thing that is there in the photo in order to display aspirations. And you need to know the context to do that. And the way we worked was very collaborative. I mean, although I'm giving the talk, all the ideas are collective. They come from 9 people working together in an unusual way. It's comparative but also collaborative. And one of the ways we made it collaborative was that at the end of each month, we all sent quite extensive reports. Instead of collaboration coming after the fieldwork, it was during the fieldwork. We sent extensive reports, we discuss them, we meet online, and we collectively agree what we're going to focus on in the following month. So it's very much team-based. And one of the advantages of that is that normally when you're an anthropologist, you go to a place and it's amazing. There are all these things you never expected. But after a while, you start to get used to it. And you almost forget that this is something that needs explaining because it starts to become obvious to you. But in our project, it was different because what would happen would be this. So the person from Brazil is coming along and saying, oh, well, you know, why do people post? What do they post? Well, actually, the people, I'm in a very low-income place in Brazil, they post they don't post by their actual houses, which are very poor and half-built. I mean, of course, they don't want people to see that, right? They post when they are by the gym. They post when they are at a swimming pool. They post what they would like to be seen as, right? And that's obvious. Of course, that's what they do, as you can see here. And they write that report. But the problem is, the person who is working in Chile comes back and says, what are you talking about? I work also in a low-income area in Chile. And here, everybody knows each other very well, and you can't post something that isn't true. Everybody knows you're not able to afford to go to a swimming pool. You'd never post that. And actually, they try to create a community around a sense of equality. That we know we're looked down upon by the rich, etc., but we are going to create a modest community of equality and everybody posts the same kind of thing. So immediately you're seeing that these two people in their conversation have to say, oh, okay, the thing I thought was obvious, maybe it's not so obvious. And maybe, therefore, what I've got to do, I have to come up with an explanation of why in my particular community they do it this way, and you have to find one for why in your community they do it that way. And that, in a sense, is how the project emerges. So I'll give another example. In my case, in England, people are obsessed by the idea that social media is the end of privacy, right? You just are not going to have such a thing as privacy in the future. Because all these things out there, these people out there, they know everything about you. They know where you are, what you like, and who you fancy, or everything, right? They know it all now. There's no privacy anymore. It's the death of privacy. But then the person working in the factory says, wait a minute, what are you talking about? 250 million Chinese people, not a little number, they come from a rural area. In that rural area, people didn't have their own place to sleep. Nobody knocked on doors. There was no experience that you would have called privacy. And when they come to the factory, they live in dormitories like this. Everybody can overhear everything, right? For people in that situation, like this girl, she just heard this word privacy like some new modern thing and thought, that sounds cool, I want a bit of that. And on social media, she is able to find ways of communicating that other people aren't able to access. And so, whereas the English people are saying it's the death of privacy, for 250 million Chinese factory workers, it's the birth of privacy. So you can see these radical differences making us understand things. And the same can take place even within a single site. So instead of generalizing about social media, you have to start to pay attention to, as it were, the materiality, the genre, the form that is there and what they are used for. So, in this strict Muslim society on the border of Turkey and Syria, you have an interesting issue. People often ask us, is the life that is portrayed on social media similar to the life that people have offline? What's the difference? Actually, we came up with a surprising result, I think, which is that by and large, people portray on social media a life that is much more conservative than offline. Why is that? Well, in this case, it's fairly obvious, at least with things like Facebook, because if you're a young Turkish woman in this strict Islamic society, and you just post when you are sitting somewhere having a coffee, and there's a man in the background, right? And all your relatives see it, and it's like, who is this man? How do you know him? What's going on? Etc., etc. So even though people are starting to be able to go out to cafes, etc., they can't show this online. They mainly show pictures of food, because nobody is going to give them a problem over these pictures of food, right? But at the same time, on things like WhatsApp, they can establish relationships that previously they had never been able to do without the surveillance of their parents, etc. And thus the 500 messages to the secret boyfriend, 500 a day, note. So again, you see these extraordinary differences, which is the reality of what social media is. And that's the reason why the primary volume that came out of this work is not called How Did Social Media Change the World? It was called How the World Changed Social Media. And that goes back to my initial point. Social media is the creation of consumption. These are acts of creative consumption. They don't produce the technology of the platform, but in consuming it, they create worlds that are distinct and relevant to the specific situation they are in. So we are still very much studying acts of consumption. Each of them then are made relevant to their place. In my case, I think that I had what everybody in the project agreed was the weirdest population of the lot, who were known as the English. So what's weird about the English? What do they do with social media? What they did was this, in the village I was in. People in England have this idea that once upon a time they used to live in proper communities, and over time that's declined. Historically, there's all sorts of reasons for thinking that's not true, but they believe it, right? So when social media comes along, it's like, oh, this is great, we can bring back community. So everybody goes on to Friends Reunited and sites like that, and the people they were at school with and lost contact with, the cousins who live in the north of England, everybody come, and social media is networking, it's bringing this group together. Goes on for about 3 months. And mainly what it does is make them realize why they lost contact with those people, right? Actually, they don't particularly want to be friends with those people they lost contact with at school, etc. But they're creative as consumers, the English. So then what they do is they say, but actually, you know, social media, there was a tradition in England of what we call net curtains. You observe, but they can't observe you, right? So what they do is they put people at a kind of distance. They say, you know, Facebook is amazing because, I mean, those people up north, they were my relatives. I can't be rude to them. Or this person, you know, I went on holiday with and got a bit closer than I kind of should have done. I mean, I'm not going to actually dump them because, well, you know, but I don't actually want to see them again. But that's okay because they're on Facebook. So because they're on Facebook, I don't actually have to have them in my house. I don't actually have to have a long telephone call with them. So in a way, what Facebook is doing is it's creating a kind of distance, like the English weather. It's sort of grey. It's not too cold. It's not too warm. The relationship is just English. Other people do it in other societies, but nothing like to the same extent. And that's the point. The English make social media into something that is quintessentially English, as does each group in its own way. Okay, I think I've said enough at the moment about these cultural differences. There are also, however, general transformations that we're aware of. And these move us in some ways from the consumption angle to the material culture angle. Because actually, one of the things that social media has done is to transform human communication. I think you can say that, in as much as traditionally we communicate in two main modes. We speak, there's the oral, or we type, there's the written. But with social media, there is a third, the visual, as an act of ordinary communication. So when a platform is called Snapchat, photograph chat, that's exactly what it means. It is chatting all day, because young people realized that already they were developing things like emojis, emoticons, etc. But in fact, they could use their own face all day long to actually demonstrate to their friends what kind of mood they were in. And that becomes a form of communication in its own right. And you can watch how the genres and the aesthetics of these kinds of visuals get transformed. So in a way, something like Facebook is not so different from traditions of analog photography. You can still put things in albums and sort them and think of them as you used to do with photography, like a wedding album or a holiday album, etc. But already there are interesting changes. So for example, the difference between, in Facebook, the ones that you choose for people to see and the ones you get tagged in tend to be very different. So that's actually, I think, one that I put on and wanted people to see. These were the photos I was tagged on, and we're going to go on quickly because I didn't particularly want them to see. This is one of the other people in the team. That's the photos he put up. These are the photos he was tagged in, right? So in a way, it's not even, as people think, this kind of self-expression. It's actually often that it's like somebody else is dressing you in the morning. Because, of course, the main thing people look at is the tagged photos. They know they're going to be more interesting than the ones you choose to put up for yourself. What you then find is that genres start developing around these visual media. I cannot say exactly why almost all the school kids that I worked with, when faced with the camera on a phone, will stick their tongue out or do this, but they all do, right? Hundreds and hundreds of images like this, okay? In a sense, I think the irony is that it, used to say, oh, smile, but that seemed very formal. So now they're trying to be informal, but since they're all informal in the same way, it becomes effectively an established genre. So you can look at, as it were, the aesthetics of these things and compare the way they exploit different areas. So in Twitter, for example, Twitter is the one where you can put up something, but it's got to be funny if it's a visual, right? It's got to have some kind of joke in relation to it. And quite often, it's banter. It's like being, well, nasty to other school kids is actually what it's about. It's playground stuff that's going on, but it's going on in terms of visuals. Whereas Instagram is where you kind of filter the things and you put up something and you spend 2 weeks and you put up a really nice set of images that you are very proud of. So these are the holiday images that go on Instagram as opposed to the rest of the album that might go on something like Facebook. And again, they can be quite cute. That's very acceptable in Instagram. However, because they are aestheticized in that way, the same ideas that we developed in the study of aesthetic forms also work in this domain. So if you think of somebody like Bourdieu talking about the differences between sort of high class and lower class aesthetic domains, actually, even the school kids find ways of creating Instagram photos that are basically sort of clever. You know, when you can make sunburn into an interesting picture, it's clearly different from something like a sunset. And that's exactly the point that Bourdieu was making of traditional photography, but moved now into this new domain. Even these platforms now have their own kind of history. I mean, Snapchat, I think, is fascinating because, firstly, in a way, the importance of Snapchat is only comprehensible in relation to the previous experience of Facebook. Because what the kids found is they were putting things onto Facebook, and then 3 years later they're trying for a job, and actually it was embarrassing. Or because Facebook was already accruing a kind of history, a legacy, and that came back to, as we say, bite the people that were using it. So when something came along and said, you know, after 10 seconds you can delete, it will automatically delete, that then becomes attractive precisely because of the circumstances in relation to the history, like 5 years of history, that we have seen of these different platforms. But then that changes, because people then see that and say, oh, well, I can do all sorts of things because it's going to delete after 10 seconds, including things I possibly shouldn't otherwise have been doing. And then they discover, oh, it's very easy to screen capture and keep it, and then it gets circulated, and then you regret it. So Snapchat then, in a sense, reiterates that kind of history as people kind of learn what its implications are and what you do with it. Now, I think, unfortunately, when I'm asked about the social media, the 9 out of 10 journalists will concentrate on one form, which is the selfie. So I do have to briefly address it. And the point, I think, is that the word selfie is maybe a little bit too like the word selfish. So it's automatically assumed that this is evidence for what everybody wants to see, which is the rise of young people being selfish, individualistic, narcissistic, and whatever. However, actually, our job is precisely to show that there are marked differences and genres within each of these particular groups. So if you pick something like the selfie, sure, you can get the classic kind of glamorous selfie, which is put up on something like Instagram. But when it came to looking at selfies on, say, Facebook, what I actually found, even with these young people, was that 5 times as many selfies were not of individuals, but actually of groups. Because what a selfie represents mainly is a chance to demonstrate something that is very important to these younger people, which is expressions like bestie or BFF, best friends forever, if any of you have kids of the right age. So when somebody points the thing at you, you put your arm around them. You know, these are my besties. And you form a group together. And I do not see that as individualistic, narcissistic, and all the rest of the rubbish. In fact, the most common kind of selfie is probably at least at this time, something I would actually prefer to call the ugly, because it's basically a picture of you as ugly as you can possibly be. The technique is very easy. You take your phone, you put it under your chin, and you take a picture up your nose, right? In case you have a reason to do this. Why do they do that? Is because those are the images that are circulated around things like Snapchat, and as I'll say in a moment, that's all to do with building trust between people. But the point is, if you take the selfie seriously, you can also start to understand that there can be serious selfies. I have a book coming out actually on the 29th, in 2 days, called The Comfort of People. And it's a book about some work I was doing on the side of this, which was a study of the use of media by patients of a hospice. So people basically who, by and large, have been given a terminal diagnosis, mainly of cancer, but they may still be alive for months or even years in that situation, and looked after in relation to the hospice. And one of the younger people I was dealing with was this guy, Matt, who died of esophageal cancer. And at the time, he explained to me that actually Facebook is really interesting because it's not just that it saves a lot of time. I don't have to tell people every single stage of what's going on in my cancer or my chemotherapy to each person in turn. I can tell them collectively. But also, he said, I think what it does is it helps me at the moment of posting to acknowledge to myself what is happening in relation to the development of my own illness. And at that time, he used as his cover picture this particular image. And what I found fascinating was it's not just a selfie, it's a mirror selfie. And if you think in terms of Velasquez and Las Meninas and Foucault's analysis, it's not all of that, but actually it is quite a precise fit between this way of understanding how, in a sense, the vision of the other is also interpolated with a self-understanding of one's position relative to that, because the selfie that shows that best is precisely a mirror selfie. So I do believe that because of the creativity, the consumption practices of people, they are entirely capable of turning selfies into actually quite profound objects. The other visual form, as material culture, that we certainly needed to think about and analyze is the meme. Because the meme didn't really exist prior to social media, and there are just vast numbers of them circulating around, and we just want to know, what the hell are all these things doing? What are all these memes? And actually, we found that there were two main varieties, let's say, of memes. One is ones that are used in kind of serious vein, often in religious contexts like this. So this is a Hindu meme, because Hindus believe that early in the morning they could start the day as a blessed state as possible, so that if you can send out a blessing to all your friends at 6:30 in the morning, that is a good way to start the day. And there's lots of Pentecostal and other kinds of memes. Probably more familiar to you are the kind of jokey memes, of which there are many different varieties. This is one from England. This will be a typical one from a place like Trinidad. And when we looked at these together, we basically came to a conclusion that we call memes the moral police of the internet. So why the moral police of the internet? Because basically, all of these are in a way in which people express values. The values they agree with, the values they don't agree with. And a lot of the people that we are working with, they are not necessarily even very literate, and they're certainly not necessarily very confident. They're not going to write a whole screed about the values that they support and the ones they don't support. But by clicking and sharing on memes that basically say things about politicians or about women or about whatever topic they want to demonstrate their relationship to, it's a very easy way of demonstrating your affinity with the moral values that are circulating around. And that's particularly important for anthropologists, I think, because at the center of everything we do is the understanding of normativity. And the problem with something like this is in conventional anthropological study, you can say, oh, over decades, this society seemed to feel that this was appropriate and this was inappropriate. But this stuff changes every few months. So how is it that in a few months, everybody seems to know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate when it comes to the world of posting? And one of the answers is that actually, if you look carefully at the content, you can see technologies for the construction of the normative, and that's exactly what memes are about. However, having said that, even within this visual and with all these generalizations, there are clearly major differences that are taking place between different sites. So, when you look through hundreds and thousands of images online, you can start to see the generalities. So you can start to see, for example, that Trinidadians think very carefully about what to wear, how to pose, and how they should look when they're going to post online. And the English people don't. A marked difference between the two populations. You can also see really interesting ways in which social parameters that we study all the time get manifested. So within the English older community, we find a really interesting ways in which gender is expressed. And in terms of gender, what happens is that English women appear to have this category called wine. And one of the things that's shocking about it is they make no differentiation whatsoever about different kinds of wine, right? It would offend a lot of people who are like into wine. As far as they're concerned, there is a thing, it is called wine. And the problem is, what relationship do we have to this thing called wine? And if the women post in relation to that, the men obviously post in relation to a category called beer, right? And so these differences manifest themselves. Similarly, men in England will post food, but the food has to be fattening, right? It's food that is bad for you. Otherwise, you don't post it, right? That is what male food posting looks like. Women post about food, but their posting is very, very commonly about the diametric opposite, which is issues around diets and dieting and or refusing the pressures that brings with it. And sort of finally, on this kind of visual material, well, actually not finally, you find that there are also differences that are quite specific to particular populations. So one of the main characteristics, I would say, of English visual posting is that it expresses a particular kind of English humor, which we call self-deprecation, right? Which means that what you like to post is, I put the plug on upside down. I came out this morning with boots of different colors. Basically, I am an idiot, right? English people find it very funny to call themselves idiots. And they do lots of humor of that kind. In Trinidad, no way is anybody going to post things about that. They will post, on the other hand, genres like nationalistic postings that actually the English people very rarely will post at all. So very, very different genres. Or they will post carnival or bling, or they will post like big extended families, which again, the English by and large will not do because they're reflecting differences between those societies. And we have a book called Visualizing Facebook, which is a direct comparison between the posting on English sites and the posting on Trinidadian sites. This I think is the last difference in terms of visual postings. What happens to social media when you become a mother? What happens? Well, if you're English, this is what happens. These are the sequential profile pics of an English mother. At the beginning, she is there, okay? and for a little bit, she is there with her baby. But after a not very long period, she completely disappears. This is not the profile picture of her infant, this is her profile picture, right? The infant comes to stand for her. She is almost only a mother. And the site becomes effectively a site which expresses and subsumes herself underneath the sense of being a new mother. What she wants to show people all the time, endlessly, are pictures of the new baby. Now, go back to Trinidad. These are new mothers in Trinidad. Trinidadian mothers think, no way is anybody going to think that just because I'm a mother, I'm one iota less glamorous, interesting, etc., than I was before I was a mother. So they are going to post images which make very clear that you cannot look at me and just think that, yeah, sure, I'm a mother, but there's all these other things I still am, as well as being a mother. And this, of course, is so much the point of what we're trying to do. As material culture, as consumption, we understand, instead of these generalities about social media, that we have to see how they become expressive of these differences between the different populations around the world. It's just not the same. Now, within that, however, we will make a few generalities. One, saying them very, very briefly because of time, one of the points we make is this term, through this term polymedia. And very briefly, what this meant to us is not simply that there's a lot of different media you can use. It's also that it transforms media and makes it more social and more moral. Why? Because previously, when you were going and having a communication with somebody, the main reason you chose a particular form, texting or something else, was usually reasons of cost or access. So you understood why they gave a Filipino sent a text. It didn't cost them anything. Now you have phone plans, you have computer plans. So there isn't any difference in terms of cost which one you choose. So when your girlfriend dumps you and does it by WhatsApp, you sit there and say, bloody hell, couldn't she at least give me a phone call? There is a morality to the choices being made as to which medium is used. And that actually transforms our relationship to media as a whole. The second general point is if you're doing all this work on social media, somebody's going to say, what's social media? What's your definition of social media? And we created a definition which we call scalable sociality. And very briefly, the point is this, that prior to all this, we have two main kinds of media. We have private, dyadic, telephone calls, letters, or we have public, newspapers, television, whoever wants to be in the audience can be. Then you start to get email, websites, etc., web chat, which starts to be a bit more in between. Email can be to a group. And then along comes social media. And social media, on the one hand, seems to come down from the public communication. I am, as it were, broadcasting, but only to the 300 people I have on my Facebook account. And then at the other end, we start to get things like WeChat, which develop upwards from the dyadic, like WhatsApp, to maybe the 10 people who really do want to see the photograph of my new infant every 10 minutes. Once you look at this whole pattern, you can see that effectively they've filled in all the gaps between the original dualism between the private and the public as a set of scales. You choose one that is this size of group, that degree of privacy. And so you scale your sociality. We could do it without technology before, but now we can do it through technology. So typically, as in the English school children, people from the age of 11 are using about 5 different platforms. And if you look at them, you can organize them along this principle. So you start with Snapchat, which is the smallest group, because you're sending an ugly photograph of yourself to your 10 best friends. because you're basically saying, I trust you not to send this ugly photograph to anybody else. So it's basically a bonding mechanism between a very small group. With WhatsApp in the schools, you've got usually three. You've got the one where the boys talk about the girls, the one where the girls talk about the boys, and the one where the girls and boys talk together. Twitter is now the classroom account. So if a school teacher wants to make sure all the kids know about homework, they will use Twitter to do that. Facebook has shifted up to things like that's where your family is, maybe your neighbors are, if you're starting work. Instagram is the only one where you're quite happy to have strangers. Why? Because you spent 2 weeks finding this really nice image, right? It's a really beautiful image. And you put it up on Instagram, and somebody from Sweden likes it. And it's like, wow, somebody from Sweden liked my Instagram picture. And that's good. So you can see, if you rank them all together, how scalable sociality actually operates within a particular context. The third general point I want to make is absolutely central to the sense that this is the consumption of material culture. Because most of the work that is done on this issue comes out of things like internet studies, computer studies. So not surprisingly, people are looking for causation on the basis of what they know. The affordances of the particular technology lead people to behave in this way or they behave in that way. The problem for that is that in our analysis, we find a huge amount of evidence for what we call content migration. So if you take one of the genres I've been talking about, the way school children interact with each other, it starts as banter in the playground. Then it moves to BBM, BlackBerry messaging services, because BlackBerries were very cheap and kids could afford them. And it was one of the first kind of social media. Then in some countries it moves to Facebook. In England, where I'm working, it's actually moved to Twitter. Remember all those vodka diet ones, right? Where the kids are interacting. Playground banter, but on Twitter. But the point is this. If you could have the same genre of communication, and it just doesn't care whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp or Snapchat or wherever, then it can't be the result of technological causation, right? It doesn't work. And it means you have to start studying this instead as the creative consumption and appropriation of these diverse technologies. And my final generality, since I think I was asked to refer to philosophy, I will, is that most of these are emerging upwards from evidence. But sometimes you do have to come downwards from realms such as philosophy. And in this particular instance, it was because we felt that time and again, people look at these kind of changes and they make claims. And typically they will make a claim that goes one of two ways. They might say, oh, it's terrible because with all these new technologies, we have lost our humanity. Our humanity is draining away. We used to be real, authentic people drinking together, and now everybody's staring at their screens. They forget that they're staring at their screens to actually talk with people they want to be interacting with. But it's like we've lost our humanity. Or another group will come along and say, oh, wow, this stuff's amazing, you know? We're not even really just humans anymore. We are post-human. We are transhuman. We are cyborgian, right? And these two responses keep coming up whenever you have these new technologies developing. Now, new technologies are going to continue being developed. 10 years from now, there'll be another set. And again, we're going to have people saying, oh, we've lost our humanity, or we are now post-human. And it's getting boring. So maybe the problem is with the concept of humanity. So we developed this thing called the Theory of Attainment, in which we said there is a problem with the concept of humanity. And the problem is that it's a conservative concept. People use the word humanity to refer to everything that people have been up to now. But instead, we need to think about the conceptualization of humanity as incorporating all the things we are going to be in the future, in 100 years' time, etc. Because these technologies allow us to attain something that was always latent. Human beings can't fly, but then we have airplanes. They can fly. They attained the capacity because of a new technology, but they're still human. And therefore, in some of our work, it's conceptual work and not just coming up from the evidence. Okay, because I want to have some time for questions, hopefully, a couple final things. If we claim that we have this understanding of these new digital technologies and new communication, then a person has a right to come to us and say, okay, then show us how you have learned to use these technologies better. Can you demonstrate that you have this understanding through something you yourself have done? Now, in our case, the thing that we would want to do as researchers is to turn this into education, turn this into things that people can learn from. That's our job. And so, because of the work we've done, we looked at the way people learn. We recognize that today so much informal learning is through things like YouTube videos under 5 minutes. And we say, if we want to really get this out there, we need to respect that. And we need to think about the different kinds of audiences that you would want to reach. So what we did was we created a kind of ecology of research dissemination in which the social media, like the tweeting, etc., finds its place. And it goes from the most introductory, which is like the website, where you call things discoveries, because that's what people want you to call them, through to the YouTube videos, through to things like the online free course. And then, of course, for us, the most important would be the books. And there were 11 books coming out of this project, 12 include the Hospice one. 2 of them haven't yet come out. But they are all, everything we do is open access. Everything is free, everything is online, and everything tries to be clear. And by putting all these things together, you can create a dissemination strategy that I think is much more powerful than any one of them. So what I am very happy about is the fact that, of course, what you really want people to read are the books. That's your 2,000 pages of evidence. And at the moment, we have already reached more than 250,000 book downloads. And for an academic, 250,000 book downloads is good news. Because traditionally, an anthropological monograph would sell about 600 copies if you were lucky. So we would say, yes, we have tried to learn from what we have studied, and we have tried to use what we have studied. And what's even better for us is the download figures from countries like Ethiopia, 1,500, Philippines, 2,500, which means we're reaching the populations that we also have traditionally worked with, which is exactly what we would want. As in fact you could see there. So finally, again to respond to one of the requests, this project is finished. As far as I'm concerned, I've written the last paper I'm going to write on social media. And part of the reason for that is things move on. And yes, as was mentioned, I have been very fortunate in that I have a second European Research Council advance grant, which is what paid for the last project. So, what is the ambition of the next project that we're going to be working on for the next 5 years? Some of it is just what you've heard. We've assembled a team this time of 12 anthropologists, and they're meeting from next month, and in February they will all start 12 simultaneous 16-month ethnographies in different places, like there's a couple in Africa, etc., so it's a bit different. The topic is moved on. The thing that it probably has most in common with this is they will represent general ethnographies of the smartphone. Because I think actually social media is going to actually, in a short while, no longer going to be a thing. It's going to be part of the app world that exists on smartphones. Makes sense to me that we move on to the world of the smartphone. But we're looking also at smartphones as they move upwards in age, and the intellectual side we're interested in, which I could talk to another time if you want to, is about the changing experience of age. So age studies normally are based on youth or based on the elderly. This is neither. This is people between 45 and 70 who don't know what the hell they are, right? So we're trying to understand that transformation because with longer life expectancy, etc. And the fact is the technology can be orientated to youth activities on the one hand, it's associated with youth. On the other hand, there is being a huge increase this year and the next few years, or the last few years, the next few years, in areas such as mobile health apps. And Tanya's somewhere here who's an expert on these things. And we want to see, I mean, we did with the last project, we used our understanding to try and develop new forms of dissemination. This time, we want to go direct into the question of can we actually improve the welfare of populations. We absolutely do not want our project to be only a critique of what is going on out there. We want to take responsibility and say, actually, you can improve people's welfare as a result of anthropological investigation of this kind in a way you cannot do without that kind of long-term qualitative ethnography. And actually, this will bring us back to actually making technologies the things that, in part, make people, to go back to the title of the workshop. And that's what the project is called. And we will start blogging on it properly next month. So that's the space for the next 5 years. And I'll end there.